Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. We'll go ahead and get started with today's report webinar. Yesterday, we launched our 6th annual Solar in the Southeast report. And today we are going to discuss the contents of the report with the SACE's Solar Program Director, Brian Jacob, as well as SACE's Research Director, Maggie Schober, and SACE's Executive Director, Dr. Stephen A. Smith. Just a few housekeeping things before we get into it. We are recording this webinar, so we will send out the recording to all registered participants following the webinar. We'll also have it posted on our website at cleanenergy.org, so stay tuned for that. In addition, we will have a Q&A at the end of this webinar. If you have a question, you can submit it using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please do not submit a question using the chat function and submit it using the Q&A box. We have lots of folks on this webinar today, so if we do not get to your question, please know that we have it recorded, but reach out to us to follow up after the webinar. You can reply to the email that we'll send with the follow-up materials, or we'll also have Brian Jacobs' contact information listed on the screen. So without further ado, we can go ahead and dive into the report, and I'll pass it over to you, Steve.
Great. Thank you, Kate, and thanks for everyone for joining. We're very excited at SACE. As you know, SACE is a regional nonprofit that does work throughout the Southeast on making sure that we have clean, safe, and healthy communities. And the solar report, this being the 6th annual, is a very important part of our work. It's part of our mission to make that transformation to clean energy. And we firmly believe that solar power is a workhorse technology for the Southeast because one of the blessings we have in the Southeast, we have a great climate. We're blessed with plenty of sunshine, and that sunshine, that power from our nearest star really helps deliver an enormous amount of power that as we capture more and more of it, we can put to clean use for our human needs. So this is the 6th annual report. When we first started looking at this, there was only about 6,000 megawatts of solar on the ground in the Southeast, and it was slowly but surely making progress. Now we're over 18,000 megawatts, and that's exciting that we've seen that significant growth over the 6-year period. But we've also had some really significant headwinds that have manifested in this time period. I mean, no one would have anticipated a global pandemic, the COVID pandemic that rocked the world, and then the implications that have come out of that with both the supply chain disruptions that the industry has dealt with and that we've all struggled with, the impacts that that's had on utility planning, and then the repercussions coming out of the pandemic as we tried to turn the corner with worldwide inflation exploding across all the countries of the world, and really seeing how that has had an impact in how the industry itself has had to deal with planning and financing and other things. So these have been some real significant challenges, but even through those challenges, the solar industry has continued to grow and move forward. There's also, though, been some really positive changes that we've seen, and we're in an unprecedented opportunity there, particularly with the federal legislation that has come through with the Inflation Reduction Act. And we've talked a little bit about that last year, but it is, as we're seeing that act, that federal legislation beginning to take hold, it is going to have an unprecedented impact on not only the solar industry, but the whole way we produce and consume power, which is vitally necessary because all through this same period, we've seen the ravaging impacts of climate change not slow down at all. They're actually accelerating. And, just the images of what we saw in New York over the past few weeks with the ravaging fires that are going on in Canada, the fact that we're seeing unprecedented levels of sea surface temperatures happening in our oceans right now, very concerning. These manifestations are extraordinarily serious. And that's why solar is such an important part of the energy solutions and how we're going to solve the climate crisis and how we're going to move forward. So having the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act kicking in, and having the federal government leaning in and providing opportunities to really accelerate this technology is really exciting. The other thing that I would want to emphasize is that at SACE, we see this as a generational transition that we are part of. This moment, this dual reality of the tremendous growth, the tremendous opportunities that are happening with the clean energy sector, the fact that we have the federal support, the fact that these technologies are growing very fast, you've got to hold that in one hand. And then the ravaging forest fires, the devastation that's happening in our oceans, the fact that we're seeing these unprecedented temperatures and all the ramifications that are going to come from that, we've got to hold those both simultaneously. And in this moment, in this generation, SACE has identified this as you have to be part of the clean energy generation, both in a generational sense where each and every one of us are part as a living part of the generation to actually seize this moment and create change. But then also we've got to get more literally physical clean energy generation on the ground. So we encourage you to continue to track with us as SACE frames this as an important moment as part of the clean energy generation to solve this global challenge and be part of a transition in the energy sector that the world has never seen that's happening at a pace. Solar is a critical workhorse in that. And so we're really proud to bring forth our 6th annual solar report. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian and let him take you through the details, because we're really excited about the progress that we're making and the story that's unfolding here in our region. Brian?
Thanks, Steve. We're back. And by that, I don't just mean that SACE is back with our 6th annual Solar in the Southeast report, but that the industry, the solar industry is back. And not that it ever really stopped. Steve talked about some of the headwinds that we confronted and overcame. But this time last year, when we were introducing this report, we had to scale back on our forecast because of the very significant supply chain disruption that was affecting the industry. There's 2 things that have us growing now faster than ever. One of those is that right before last year's report, and this is all why I'm starting with policies behind the performance. This slide, or this page of the report, it's page 11. So I'm not going to go sequentially through the report for you. I want to start with policies because I think that's the most important driver right now. But when we were releasing last year's report, President Biden had just stepped in right before that, and through his executive authority had put a temporary pause on any tariffs that might be imposed at the time on 4 key supply countries, the Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Malaysia. Some of you will remember that. And that helped put us back on an even keel. And you may even know, some of you that are watching this closely may know that Congress actually tried to vacate that authority. President Biden doesn't veto things very often. I understand he had to veto something yesterday, but that I think was only like the 6th time that he's used the veto pen. But on this Congressional Review Act that they sent about whether he had the authority to impose this pause, he threatened to veto it, and then when they sent it to his desk, he did veto it, and Congress didn't have the votes to overturn his veto. So it was an empty threat and mostly just posturing. But that was the first thing that really kind of got us back on track. And then right after the president did that through executive authority, then Congress did step in last year and kind of turbocharged the rebound with the Inflation Reduction Act. And obviously there's a lot of dimensions to the Inflation Reduction Act. The 2 that I think are most impactful on the solar sector, one are the tax credits, both the investment tax credit, the ITC, and the production tax credit, the PTC. But then also a new program that's focused on the co-op community, the rural electric co-ops. It's called New Era. It stands for Empowering Rural America. It's $9.7 billion that USDA is structuring into a competitive grant program. And the co-ops are now maneuvering to apply for those funds. So on the first of those things, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, many of you know this, what the Inflation Reduction Act did was return it to its full 30% valuation and extend it out for another 10 years, out to 2032. So it provided certainty into the market that the market really needs. And the PTC as well was returned up to its full valuation. And there's some additional components to that about paying fair wage, providing apprenticeships and so forth. And then there are some bonus credits that can get layered on. So all of that is part of the Inflation Reduction Act and really impacts the forecast, particularly beyond the 2026 timeframe that we're really looking at. Another thing that they did is that the commercial version of those tax credits are made what they call direct pay, which means they're refundable to tax exempt entities or entities that might just have a low tax liability and not enough to utilize the full value of the tax credits. So that also helps the co-op community as well, and the municipal utilities that aren't tax-paying entities. So those things are good. In fact, some rules were just issued yesterday, some draft guidance by Treasury on the direct pay provisions and the transferability of credits. And full disclosure, because I've been finishing up this report and preparing for this, I haven't read all that guidance yet, but I do know that it's out there and I'll get caught up pretty soon. New Era, again, last thing I'll mention on this slide, it remains to be seen, but I think it could be the most transformational program for rural America since the Rural Electrification Act itself back in 1936. The co-ops are actively putting together their what they call letters of interest. That's the first step in the process. The USDA will open that application process on July 31st, and then those applications will have to go in within a 30-day period, 31-day period, but by August 31st to compete for those funds. All those things as backstory, I think, cause us to have reason to be very optimistic. And only some of that optimism is reflected in the forecast so far. That's because really the cadence of the planning process for the utilities. For example, the Florida utilities all updated their 10-year site plans in April. So they had the benefit of seeing the Inflation Reduction Act and factoring it into their plans. So those are in our forecast here. Other utilities haven't had a resource planning process since August of last year when the Inflation Reduction Act was signed. So Georgia Power, for example, they do their integrated resource plan every 3 years. We had just concluded it in the middle of last year, right before the Inflation Reduction Act became law. So we won't see IRA reflected in the Georgia Power plan until 2025 when they do their next IRP. So some is already in here, but we're going to see a lot more toward kind of the back half of the decade. That being said, the current forecast out to 2026 is already super bullish. Steve mentioned that we have over 18 gigawatts already, 18,766 megawatts to be more precise, which is 3 times what we had in our first report. But we're expecting it to more than double over this 4-year time horizon. So by 2026, the Southeast as a whole will have almost 40 gigawatts of solar, just shy of 40 gigawatts. And Florida alone, as just a single state within the region, will have 17 gigawatts. So in other words, 4 years from now, Florida will have almost as much as the entire Southeast region had last year. So that is very obvious on this slide, the kind of trajectory that Florida is on. And those of you that have been with us before, remember the color scheme here. We've got the blue segments of these bars represents the utility scale solar deployments, and the yellow caps represent the distributed solar, including, in fact, primarily rooftop solar. And you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between the states. Some have substantial amount of rooftop relative to utility scale, others don't. The graph also shows that there are some states that are really not keeping pace. I mean, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi have nowhere near the amount of solar or solar ambition really represented in the forecast as compared to the other states. Switching now to our large utility system ranking. These are the largest utilities, each of them serving more than 500,000 customers in the Southeast. And there really hasn't been much change. There are a lot of familiar names at the top of the list. Tampa Electric did move into the number 2 slot. They had been number 3, so they just swapped places with Dominion Energy, South Carolina. But otherwise, the top 5 have remained the same. Duke Energy Progress is still number 1 at the top of both the current, last year, as well as the future forecast, as they have been in all 6 of our reports. They've been at the top of that list. Alabama Power, the North Carolina electric cooperatives, again appear as SunBlockers. And you may notice that we've added Power South to this list. And that's because the customer base that is served by Power South has gradually grown year after year to where they now have over 500,000 customers within that system, which qualifies them for this list. And their, say, lackluster forecast for 2026 qualifies them as a SunBlocker now as well. So they join that kind of dubious distinction list with Alabama Power and the North Carolina electric cooperatives. And that's just a mathematic objective analysis. The way it's defined, it's any of these large utility systems where their forecast for 4 years from now, 2026, is still below what the region average was last year in 2022. So if you look at the left-hand side, the region average was 580. Any of the right-hand utilities that have a forecast less than 580 would get that designation as SunBlocker. So it is those 3. TVA and Seminole came kind of dangerously close to falling into that category again, but again, it's straight math, and they managed to get above that threshold, so they no longer wear that designation as a SunBlocker. Sunrisers, on the other hand, represents our leadership category. They're the 7 utilities across the Southeast that exhibit the highest ambition over the 4 years. And that's measured by the increase in the watts per customer ratio. I didn't really explain that again today, but that's the primary metric that we use to be able to fairly and equitably compare large utilities and small utilities, or states with a large population, states with a small population. So we use that throughout the report. And for purposes of the Sunrisers, it's the utilities whose increase between 2022 and 2026 is the highest. Walton EMC is at the top of that list again, and their new forecast actually widens the margin. That's why their bar is 4 times all the others. Knoxville Utilities Board is still on this list, still number 2, despite the fact that they ended up having to cancel one of their what are known as green invest projects with TVA. So even with a lower forecast for Knoxville Utilities Board, they're still number 2 on our Sunriser list. And what I really want to point out with this slide is that we do have a new name here now. Our newest Sunriser is Santee Cooper. The state-owned utility generation and transmission utility over in South Carolina. And it's not just exclusively based on what is in their own plan. They're in an IRP process now, and the base case for their IRP has them doing 300 megawatts of solar per year starting in 2026. So that's in here. But what's really driving this is that one of the subsidiary utilities that gets their power from Santee Cooper is Central Electric Cooperative, and they're doing 575 megawatts on their own. So that gets rolled into the Santee Cooper number as well, and help earn them the designation as a sunriser. That's a bit of a success story, because in our first year's report, Santee Cooper was a SunBlocker. In fact, they were the very lowest forecast of the large utility systems. And now, in the span of 6 years, they've earned themselves a slot here on the sunriser list. Now, this is not in the report itself, but I offered this last year and we thought we'd do it again. Since we do a 4-year forecast, we had made projections. In our first year's report, we projected from 2017 out to 2021. In the second year report was a base year of 2018 projected out to 2022. So we wanted to kind of array those against what we're currently reporting and see, how utilities fared against the forecast. And it was a bit of a mixed bag last year, and it is again. Some utilities really over-delivered and others under-delivered. So let's see, Hampton Electric, Oglethorpe, Santee Cooper, obviously, exceeded expectations. All 3 of the Duke utilities, on the other hand, under-delivered relative to their forecast. Duke Energy Progress, at the top of our list, they had an exceedingly high forecast back in the 2018 report. And so they missed that by a long shot, yet they're still the highest ranked on our current and our future leaderboard. So I don't want us to get too hung up on this, because we could make the case that, for example, it would be better to have utilities in a position like Dominion, where they missed their forecast, but they're still number 3 overall, offering customers an average of 1,300 watts per customer, compared to another utility like, say, Oglethorpe came in way above their forecast, but they're still just below the region average in terms of what they offer to their customers. So this is an interesting comparison, but I don't want us to draw too much out of it. And then this is not in the report either, but we do like to offer kind of a glimpse into what we see as what's coming down the line, what's next. And these 2 macro topics are the same now that we did last year: resource planning and transmission planning. And I'm going to invite Maggie to cover these so that I can kind of catch my breath and get prepared for some Q&A. Maggie?
Great. Thank you, Brian. Hey, everyone. Maggie Schober. I'm the research director here at SACE, and I'm going to talk about what we see coming down the pike for influencing these solar forecasts. As Brian just showed, we have these forecasts that are based on what we know now, what are in current utility plans, but these forecasts shift and they're not going to be what necessarily happens in the next 4 years, et cetera. So two key things, 2 key policies and procedures that we see impacting solar, either up or down, it can go either way, are resource planning and transmission. So resource planning is an ongoing process. Each utility is doing this consistently and then goes through at regular intervals determined by its state regulations. Will file what's typically called an integrated resource plan or something similar with their commission every 1, 2, 3, or 5 years on those sorts of schedules. So we have two pretty big ones coming up that are started, have already begun, and will continue through at least the end of this year, if not both of these into next year. The first of those is Duke's 2 utilities in North and South Carolina. So that's Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. And they have just completed their stakeholder process earlier this week. And now there's kind of a waiting game. Duke will file, because they operate as a single balancing authority, each utility, they will file the same IRP in both North and South Carolina. The first filing is South Carolina in August, and then in North Carolina in September. And that is now being aligned. In North Carolina, the IRP rules have been updated to align that with the carbon plan that happened last year. And so we expect to see solar yet again play a role in meeting those carbon plan goals in Duke's 2 utilities there. The next one that we see coming up is TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. They have already begun the scoping process for their IRP, so they're in the very early stages. And what we hear is that they're going to finish that and get it approved by their board. Their goal is to have that finished and approved by the board by the end of 2024. TVA's process is quite different from any other IRP. And so, you know, there's some updates that we get through the process, but mostly we have to wait and see what they will put in a draft IRP that we expect sometime probably in the spring of 2024, so they can meet that deadline. Other utilities are updating resource plans, incorporating the Inflation Reduction Act that both Brian and Steve talked about. And, you know, for instance, we'll have filings in Florida, utilities file in April of every year, what's called a 10-year site plan there. And we've already seen the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly the tax credits on the amount of solar that was in the 10-year site plans that were filed this year compared to last year. So those are our resource planning, you know, what we see between now and the next solar report. The other, you know, I think last year was kind of an emerging issue for solar. But I hope folks are now familiar in associating transmission and solar together, because solar transmission, the grid, and the way that transmission is planned in our region, and this is happening in other regions as well, has really become a barrier toward that acceleration of solar deployment that we would have expected. So one thing that came out of Duke's carbon plan is the need to address what it calls the red zone in its Carolinas utilities, and that is expected to enable up to 3.4 gigawatts of solar to interconnect more easily in their territories. Also, somewhat coming out of the carbon plan process is that we are expecting an update to the process for how the NCTPC, which is not an organization that is very well known, even necessarily in our circles, but the North Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative. So that's where North Carolina utilities, so that includes both of Duke's North and South Carolina utilities, where they do transmission planning for the state, and they're updating their process. We'll get more updates on how they're going to update their process this summer. So far, we have just heard that they are planning to update their process. The last piece here is another acronym you may or may not be familiar with, SERTEP. That's how we tend to say this, SERTP. We gotta love the acronym soup in this industry. So that is the entity that plans across nearly all of the Southeast utilities. It's a place for these utilities to coordinate and do transmission planning across the whole region. And there is a stakeholder process for that group that has resulted this year in 5 economic planning studies that they will perform. That includes one that came out of the Georgia Power IRP last year, really focused on integrating solar in Georgia, which is, connecting the north and the south parts of the state better transmission wise. One last piece on CERTEP is that this is a process that is governed by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they are going through a proposed rulemaking process to update the requirements that FERC has for these planning entities. So we don't have a final rule on that. We don't even have a timing necessarily for a final rule on that. But if FERC does update what is required, then CERTEP will have to update its process as well, including things like looking out farther. Right now, CERTEP looks out 10 years. They may have to look out farther into the future. They may need to include additional benefits in their analysis and things like that. So those are 2 pieces. Resource planning and transmission planning are 2 things we really see driving the potential for meeting or exceeding these forecasts in 2026 and beyond, or in reducing what we see as possible in that year and beyond. So we will be involved and keeping y'all informed with all of these. So with that, I think we're ready to turn it over to Q&A, and I will turn it back to Brian.
Hey, can I, this is Steve. Let me just interject because I can't help myself here. I want to just flag an important point about how important planning is, particularly both on the resource side and the transmission side, the points that Maggie made. But here's something that I think we're really going to highlight this year is that TVA is going into an integrated resource plan, but they're using a process that is completely unorthodox compared to their peers. In every other resource plan that is being developed across the Southeast, anybody that is interested in participating in that process in a meaningful way has access to that through intervening through an independent public service commission or public regulatory body at the state level. And those processes have the ability to get access to information through discovery. Staff are literally put on for being able to be cross-examined in most of those proceedings. And the information flow is transparent and open by and large as a general rule. TVA's process is totally antiquated in the sense that TVA self-selects who actually participates in the process, limits the access to information. Much of the underlying assumptions that are going into their planning in the process are sort of hidden from the public and are reviewed by a very narrow that TVA self-selects review group to do this. And it is not transparent at all. And this is basically bad planning. And so while we appreciate the fact that TVA is doing an integrated resource plan, the fact that they don't actually let people who are interested in the party intervene and be a part of the process and have access to the information is just antithetical to a public power entity and antithetical to transparency and good planning processes. And we think that this needs to be addressed. But I just couldn't help but to put TVA on the same level in the way they do their planning as other utilities is a mischaracterization of how it actually happens. And so we're going to be raising that issue because this IRP process is so critically important for the future of TVA that they need to actually let people have access to the information and not, hide the ball from the public.
Yeah, and with the with the lead time on solar and other renewable projects, TVA can't afford to miss this opportunity in this planning process, or they will miss out on most of the federal opportunities created through the Inflation Reduction Act. So we got to get it right in this IRP. I scrolled through some of the questions, and it looks like there's some great ones that came through. But I will just, Kate, maybe let you direct where we go from here.
Yeah, thank you, Brian and Steve, for all your comments and interesting thoughts so far. To get us started off, we will just dive into some methodologies of the report and get some clarification on that. This first question is, where do the 2026 calculations for installed solar capacity come from? Is it measured by commitments from utilities, general trends, or something else, or combination of these factors?
Yes, I guess it's all those. The most important contributor to the forecast is integrated resource plans that we have access to, and we just had the conversation about TVAs being different than some of the others, where we actually can intervene in a meaningful way. But as those are completed, we track those throughout the region, and we put the solar aspects of the resource plans of the various utilities into our model. Then there are some additional things, and there's a page in the report that explains the data sources that we use, both for historic and future. But we supplement the plans with other pieces of information, announcements that are made about projects by independent power producers and developers that may not already be reflected in plans. We use some of the forecasting from the Energy Information Administration, the annual energy outlook, to kind of, it impacts our distributed solar forecast more so than the utility scale forecast, where the utilities don't really forecast how much distributed solar there's going to be, but we need to have forecasts for that and uptake rates on rooftop solar. And that varies by state, generally based on the policies that are there. So there's a lot of different dimensions to it, but the IRPs are the predominant one.
Thank you for that. And just since Steve was talking about the TVA process, we had a question that just came in. Doesn't TVA's IRP have to go through the NEPA process, which should be open to the general public?
Yeah, let me respond to that. TVA as a federal entity does have to go through NEPA, but NEPA is a fundamentally different tool for looking at broadly and bluntly, quite honestly, at environmental impacts, whereas the ability to intervene in a regulatory proceeding or intervene before a regulatory entity and to be able to have access to preliminary data, assumptions that are going into modeling, the way the models are run, and how there can be, it's the classic garbage in, garbage out. That kind of detailed analysis is not in the realm of a NEPA process. NEPA was not a tool designed to do that kind of granular critique of what are the assumptions, what is the way that the utility is building out its framework for how it makes its planning decisions beyond just the environment. That is all done deep in the belly of the beast in the sort of utility process. And that is why the regulators allow interveners to engage in this process, so that those with knowledge can highlight upstream early in the process before it's baked in where there may be erroneous assumptions, or there may be a need to have a discussion about whether the utility has left something out that's very important, whether they've made a mischaracterization of a data input that could affect the model, and then the whole downstream process is contaminated because they didn't open the process up and allow for a full and robust debate. That is what TVA is hiding the ball on, because they're self-selecting a very narrow group of players claiming that they're representing all the interests, but that is not the case. Most of the folks that serve on the IRP review group for TVA are not technically able to deal with the detail associated with the planning assumptions. That's why it should be an open and transparent process. And if you get that wrong at the beginning, the whole process is affected downstream. And then by the time it becomes a draft IRP, of which, you know, again, begins to get into the NEPA planning process and all this other kind of stuff, it's already baked in. And yes, NEPA is important for protecting the environment, but these have profound decisions about the volume, the cost, and all the assumptions that go in to whether they choose certain technologies beyond just the environment. And that's why NEPA is a piece of the puzzle, but is a very small piece, and it doesn't get at the underlying problem that we're describing here.
Thanks, Steve. That's some important clarification. We're going to pivot down to the Sunshine State. Any comments on why Florida has such a lead among southeastern states in solar capacity?
Well, it is the Sunshine State. And if you have tracked with our report for a while, you'll know that it wasn't always the case. Florida did not have a lead. North Carolina used to have the most solar of, the most solar in the Southeast and the second most in the entire country behind California. And Florida was kind of a latecomer. But then largely because of some policies that were put in place there, one of those was known as SOBRA, the solar base rate adjustment, that allows the investor-owned utilities to incorporate the cost of their solar projects into their rate base with really just a cursory review at the Public Service Commission. That enabled them to really invest in solar in a major way. And they've been doing that. And then all the investor-owned utilities there have also begun doing shared solar, which is different than community solar, but they've got subscription model solar that they're building as well, because a lot of people in the state of Florida want to be powered by solar. And so instead of just accepting what is naturally their proportional part of what's on the grid, they would like to subscribe to projects and, you know, maybe fulfill 75 or 100% of their generation needs through solar. So the utilities are responding to that demand by doing these shared solar programs in a subscription model. Those are two of the things that have really helped in Florida. Plus, Florida has net metering for rooftop solar too. So for people to make investments behind the meter on their own properties, Florida's the most attractive place to do that right now.
And I would just add, as Brian has indicated, our forecast only goes out, you know, so far, but one of the Florida's leading utilities, Florida Power and Light, has on the table the most ambitious commitment to solar of any utility that we know of, definitely in our region, and we think in the country, with their Real Zero proposal. And we think that that's going to, we're just now beginning to see where that's starting to take a little bit hold in this most recent 10 years site plan. But I think you're going to see that pace accelerate on a level that a level of ambition we've never seen from anybody else in the Southeast. And I think it's really calling into question every other Southern utility's commitment to this technology, because, you know, when you're putting on the table, you know, 93,000 megawatts of solar by 2045, that pace of growth is phenomenal. And, you know, obviously we'll see, but the fact that a leading entity like FP&L and their parent company NextEra has put that on the table has completely changed what everybody thinks is possible. And I think it is going to become the norm for this technology. And so that's going to continue to further accelerate, I think, Florida's position over time.
Yeah, for whoever asked that question, I might call your attention to the state profiles in the report, which the Florida state profile is on page 13 and rolls on to page 14 as well. But Florida Power and Light in particular, just within this 4-year timeframe that is reflected in this report, is going to go from 3,800 megawatts to 9,700 megawatts by 2026 as part of the 90 gigawatt commitment that Steve mentioned under their Real Zero program. So we're starting to see it, and we're going to see even more of it in years beyond 2026.
Going a little further with this question, this is a combination of a few questions, but one participant asked, why are some of the reasons that utilities are not on track with Florida, not as ambitious with solar? And then also kind of part two to this question, someone asked, it appears that distributed solar has been growing slowly in absolute terms, and that SACE projects that slow growth trend to continue. What are some policies and practices that could drive continued growth of distributed solar?
Okay, I'll do the second one first, and then hopefully you remember the first one. So yeah, distributed solar, and I even mentioned it as we were going through the slides, that it kind of varies by state. Some have more than others, and that is generally because of the policies that are behind it. Alabama is one of the worst states in the country, Alabama Power in particular, because they charge a penalty for putting solar on your rooftop, a solar surcharge, just for the privilege of making investment behind the meter. And consequently, they have very little distributed solar. I mentioned in response to that last question that one of the things in Florida is that they still have true net metering, right? So if you generate 100, well, say 10 kilowatt hours and only consume 8 and send 2 kilowatt hours out to the grid, but during the daytime, but then come back at night and the sun's not shining, your panels aren't generating, and you consume 2 kilowatt hours, you get that back on a true retail net metered basis. And utilities are starting to back away from that in some of the other states, or never had it at all. Like in Georgia, we've never had net metering. Even the monthly netting pilot that some of you might have heard about, that was done for 5,000 customers 2 years ago, that isn't true net metering either. So that's why we still see it going strong in Florida. Yes, there was a legislative maneuver backed by some of the utilities a year ago to try to undo net metering in Florida, and Governor DeSantis vetoed it. And then fortunately, the utilities didn't want to make a run after that again in this legislative session, but rest assured they probably will, because they're not fans of that process. Then I would also say that as distributed solar achieves certain levels of penetration, NREL did a report that basically said there is no cost shift. That's what a lot of utilities try to make the case, that a rich person putting solar on their rooftop is going to cause a poor person's bill to go up, which sounds like hogwash, because it probably is. But utilities love to make that claim. The NREL study really kind of dismissed that and said, at the levels of penetration that we have in the United States for rooftop solar, that's not an issue and won't become an issue until we get around 10% penetration. So net metering is the right policy mechanism to drive distributed solar in its infancy in the levels that we've got. Now, South Carolina and even North Carolina were achieving above 1% and now 2% penetration of rooftop solar. It becomes appropriate to start looking at what's next. And this is pretty well documented. SACE was party to a settlement with Duke Energy that covered both states to kind of develop what is the next evolution of net metering. It's called solar choice. It's netting. It still is netting, but it's within time of use periods, because not all kilowatt hours are created equal. There are times of day when it is much more expensive for the utility to produce power than others. So if you can contribute during those peak periods, you should be getting a higher degree of compensation for that. And consequently, if you're generating or consuming at off-peak periods, it should be valued lower. So that passed in South Carolina, and that was already before last year's report. But just a month ago, the North Carolina Commission approved that same next generation evolution of net metering, solar choice metering. And it will actually start on October 1st. So those are things that are in place now that help us kind of sustain the forecast for distributed solar. What was the first question again?
Brian, let me take the first one, because I think if I understood, the first question was about why Florida's utility ambition is ahead of a number of the other regional players. And I would say there's a couple of things going on there. I think one, Brian mentioned this innovative regulatory proceeding with the solar base rate initiative that allowed the utilities to get in to develop larger projects more aggressively and be able to sort of then gain some economies of scale where they're starting to do some of the investments. And I think that you've seen all three of the major utilities in Florida take advantage of that. And I think it has allowed them to get more and more comfortable with the technology as they're scaling it up. But I think the fundamental problem is that outside of Duke, because I think Duke in the Carolinas has been reasonably good at this over the years. I think when you look at Alabama, you look at TVA, you look at and Georgia Power has done some. You're not seeing any of them look at solar as a workhorse resource yet. I think that shift is happening to some degree in Florida. And I think that what we are going to see is that as we continue to scale solar and some of these federal tools are kicking in, and as I think you start to see storage become more and more a part of the overall equation, you're going to see that the numbers are absolutely in the money for solar going forward increasingly. And this is where the planning is so important, because if you're planning to build things like peaking gas plants and your assumptions around that, if you're sticking your toe in things like small modular reactors and there's no cost points for that, these are all planning assumptions that have to be dealt with early in the process that we're talking about. And if you're mischaracterizing the planning assumptions associated with solar and storage, and you're falling on the other side for building out additional fossil gas plants, or flirting with SMR, small modular reactor technologies as a way to going forward, you're going to get further and further out of the money. And it's going to become more and more apparent over time that you've made the wrong bet. But the problem is that once you start down this path and you start spending a lot of this money and all these other things, it's really hard to pull to claw some of those decisions back. And this is why it is so important that the fundamental assumptions going into these planning for some of these other utilities has to be done right. And we saw this with Vogtle, with Georgia Power, and what that has manifested into over time. We're seeing it with TVA. Alabama Power continues to miss the mark on a number of fronts. So all these things, if you don't get the planning right and you don't really work with the technology and characterize it correctly, you're not going to lean into it at the same level. And so we've got a number of utilities in the Southeast that are misplanning, inappropriately planning for what the future is unfolding to be, and they're making the wrong bets. We saw it with Vogtle. We're going to see it again with TVA and all their SMR stuff that they're chasing, all these other kind of things. People that are still building gas plants, even though we know we've got to move away from fossil gas. And until those utilities have that shift in leadership thinking and properly plan, they're going to continue to miss the mark, and customers are ultimately going to suffer both in the cost, and then we're all going to suffer from a planetary perspective.
Because the utility commissions tend to let the utilities get rate recovery for their mistakes, they're basically making those big bets with other people's money. That's really unfortunate.
Let's do a couple clarifying questions just about the report data before we wrap it up with some larger questions about federal funding. In terms of total installed solar capacity per state, is it broken out by solar type, for example, power company owned, residential rooftop, etc.?
Not in the report, no. We do just a major categorization between utility scale and distributed, and then distributed really has multiple contributing factors to it. So we'll kind of go deep in the weeds here real quickly. The main source of information for distributed solar is EIA 861, the Energy Information Administration 861, and it has a net metering, virtual net metering, and non-net meter distributed. So we aggregate all three of those into that distributed solar category. And then there are end use categories as well between industrial, residential, and commercial for net metering. So we do have those in our data set, but we aggregate them together for purposes of the report.
All right, you answered both questions there without me even asking the second one. Okay, so this potentially is the last question. So just a reminder to folks that we will send a recording out of the webinar presentation. And if we didn't get to your question, then please respond back to our email, or Brian's contact information is listed right here on the screen, and feel free to send him over an email and we will respond to that. Can you provide a little more information concerning the Inflation Reduction Act and possibilities for expanding home energy rebates and expansion of solar energy to the Southeast states, incentives, et cetera, especially in Tennessee and TVA?
Well, the main thing for residential solar investment is the investment tax credit. I was careful to point out early on that what the Inflation Reduction Act did in terms of refundability or direct pay is only for the commercial investment tax credit. So for residential, you can still get the 30%, but because it's non-refundable, if you don't have a sufficient tax liability, say you did a $20,000 solar array, it's a 30% tax credit, so you're entitled to $6,000 worth of tax credits. But if your total tax liability is only $5,000, you can't get the extra $1,000 back. So the tax credit is only worth $5,000 to you, even though it could be worth $6,000 if you had a higher income. That's unfortunate, and it's another policy thing that I want to point out. Senator Ossoff from here in my home state of Georgia is the author of a Solar Energy for All Homes Act, I think is the name of it, which would fix that. It's one of the things that got left on the cutting room floor when the Inflation Reduction Act was put together, but it's still out there and could get traction and could help to make the tax credit available to more moderate income folks, which we need, because there is some income disparity still in who's putting solar on their rooftops. If that's the last of the questions, Kay, I want to turn the tables on the audience quickly and ask a question that I know they can't answer because they can't talk, but send me the answer to this. I joked with our SACE staff that the solar report literally took on new dimensions this year. Those of you that have been with us for years know that for the first 5, we had a landscape layout, and now we have a portrait layout for the first time. And I'd just love to know, well, and that transformation wasn't nearly as easy as it sounds. Kate worked wizardry on it to make that happen. But I want to know whether you like it or dislike it, and I'd just love your feedback on that. So let me know what you think.
Yes, let us know if we did it all in vain or if it is beneficial. We encourage you, a large reason that we did that was to get in line with some of the other report formats that we have as well. So we encourage you to check out our website, cleanenergy.org, and you can find all of the state's reports, fact sheets, information, and things like that, and check out other landscape, or excuse me, portrait reports. We're no longer doing landscape. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Brian, for your presentation, Maggie for jumping in, and Steve for all of your insightful thoughts. Please take a look at the recording if you need to reference that back, the report, and then we'll also be rolling out a blog series going deeper into the report over the coming months. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.